So I would like to invite our next speaker in the session, Maria Jodlowiec.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope I can get the presentation to the screen now. Can you see it? Well, you can't see it.
Well, not yet, but I can reveal to everyone that the presentation will be about neologisms in translation.
Right. So let me do. Let me open the presentation and do screen sharing, but I'm not sure I can actually get it now. Let's hope.
So maybe before like maybe I could be of some help. So if you think this is a good idea.
Can you see it now?
No.
You cannot see it. Okay, so just one more try. Please bear with me. I apologize for all that, but
we are.
There isn't that much. Just a second. Just a moment. No. Screen sharing is difficult. Okay, maybe now. It tells me to open system preferences, and it may be difficult for that.
Shall we try this option? You know that we did before. Maybe I can show the slides. If you could just send them to me quickly, and you know.
Okay, I'll do that, even though I'm not quite sure that it's going to work well, but never mind. Let's try this option if there isn't another one. In the meantime, I'll probably just indicate that I'm going to present a sort of preliminary results of a study into I'm trying to, yes, I've got your, into the two different translations of Clockwork Orange by the same translator. And I'm sort of interested in how different kinds of cognitive effects function in both of these translations. Agnieszka, I've sent you my slides.
Yes, I'm following it.
Except that I now cannot, I do not see the room where I'm presenting. Maybe
what can you see?
Pardon?
What can you see then?
I can see only my, oh, now I can see it. Thank you. Yes, have you received my slides? Great, thank you very much, Agnieszka. Okay, couldn't you switch to the presentation mode?
I have.
You have, and can everybody see the slides?
Yes, I can. Sorry, I'm answering for everyone, even though.
Okay, great. So I'll just open another sort of window to be able to also see the slides because I cannot see them right now. Okay, so just to begin, the major goal of this presentation then is to present these preliminary results into the cognitive effects that these two versions of the Polish translation of A Clockwork Orange into English result in. The main research questions that this study seeks to answer are actually which of the two Polish versions of the novel A Clockwork Orange can be predicted to achieve the cognitive effects that are intended by the author in the present-day Polish reader. Does the post-communist generation respond to the two texts differently than those who spent childhood and youth in communist Poland? And how do the overall cognitive effects that each of the translated versions produces in the present-day reader differ? How does the Russianized and the Americanized translation affect the perception of the protagonist of the novel and its content? A few words about the book itself. The author, John Anthony Burgess Wilson, actually published under the name Anthony Burgess. He was an English writer, composer, and literary critic, but also a versatile linguist. He lectured on phonetics and was an accomplished translator. But he's most famous as the author of A Clockwork Orange, published in 1962. In 2005, A Clockwork Orange was included on Time magazine's list of the 100 best English language novels written since 1923. A Clockwork Orange is a presents a dystopian vision of society in an unspecified future. It is not just unpleasant and nightmarish. It is a bizarre and brutal kind of image of the future with no sign of hope, in fact. The novel is in the form of autobiography of the main character, Alex. Alex is a heartless teenager with no moral values. He is responsible for a number of brutal deeds. He is a thief, a rapist, and an arsonist. When he's finally captured and imprisoned, he is given a chance to receive pardon and freedom by submitting to a psychiatric experiment. This psychiatric experiment has to do with vicarious participation in acts of violence. As a result of this aversion therapy, he cannot defend himself against others and, in fact, can no longer enjoy his favorite type of music, that is classical music. What is interesting about the novel is not just this very bizarre and nightmarish vision of the future, but the language of the novel. The title itself is very interesting. It is an adaptation from a piece of slang, Cockney slang to be more exact, which, as Burgess explains in one of his in his autobiography, comes from the expression as queer as a clockwork orange, which means very queer indeed. But there is also a wordplay involved here. In Malay, that Burgess actually could speak, orang stands for man. So the second meaning is that of a clockwork person, a person fully controlled, who functions as a robot and has no control over his actions, somebody else controls him. The language of the novel is as queer as the title suggests. And it's the result of the language or this important aspect of it that has to do with how the teenage gangsters communicate in the language is Burgess's linguistic experiment. Burgess invented a special kind of argot called nadsat as the language of communication of the gangsters in the novel. So nadsat is the language used by those teenage gangsters. The word itself is a coinage from Russian, where suffix nadsach means teen in English. Most of the non-English words used in nadsat are of have got Slavic roots. And most of the neologisms that Burgess uses are of Russian origin, or to be more exact, they are anglicized versions of Russian words. The slang that is used also embraces rhyming slang and new word formations. Now, the question to ask is probably, why did Burgess use Russian and not Arabic or German, which he also was competent in? Well, as is convincingly argued by Evans, for the Anglo-American reader, the Slavic words connote the communist dictatorship, the society without moral value and without hope. So that was probably one of the most important reasons. So Burgess actually makes the argot Russian to warn his readers of what society may become if it communizes itself along the Soviet lines. As Burgess himself points out in the second volume of his autobiography, You've Had Your Time, I quote, "As the book was supposed to be about brainwashing, it was appropriate that the text itself should be a brainwashing device." So nadsat is used in the novel to shock the reader, to introduce him or her to the world in which important human values are challenged, to the world which is alien and bizarre, in which one does not feel safe because the human being becomes a fully controllable robot who could be molded as required. And these I take to be these overall cognitive effects intended by employing nadsat by Burgess. Interestingly enough, two Polish versions of the translation exist by the same translator. That's quite, the two Polish versions are by Robert Stiller, the late Robert Stiller. They appeared in the last decades of the 20th century. And in fact, there was the third one that he started, that the translator started to work on, but actually never finished because he passed away. So there is the Russianized version, the Polish title of which can be rendered in English as A Mechanical Orange, published originally in 1974 and then later on republished in 1999. Stiller refers to it as the R version for Russian, of course. It is the version that enjoys the status of official translation of A Clockwork Orange. But there is also the Americanized version, the title of which is different, as you can see, and translates into English as a wind-up orange. This is named a version A by the translator for Americanized. And as I've already indicated, Stiller wanted to produce the third version, Germanized version under the title that could be rendered in English as a spring-assisted orange. It was supposed to be called version RN, but unfortunately it was never completed. Now we are dealing here then with an unprecedented situation of one translator producing two entirely different target language versions of the same source text. What needs to be considered in this context is the time of the publication of the two different translations. That is roughly 1970s for the Russianized version and 1990s for the Americanized version. It must be remembered that in 1970s, Poland belonged to the communist bloc. And 25 years later, when the Americanized version appeared, Poland had just liberated itself from Russian hegemony and was looking up to America for guidance and help. So there was the vision of cultural dominance of American culture on the horizon in the 1990s. In the Russianized version, as can of course be expected, relies on neologisms mainly formed on the basis on Russian. Many of them actually have their roots in vulgar and offensive expressions. As a number of critics point out, this version conveys a contemptuous attitude towards the language of the former oppressor. The American version relies on neologism based on Hollywood language and English pop culture vocabulary. To be more exact, it uses anglicized transcriptions of these words. So the language is supposed to reflect the reality that post-communist Poland aspiring in the 1990s, actually what the reality was like in the Poland of the 1990s, with pro-capitalist sentiments and overtones of snobbery transparent in the type of language that the translator uses for this version. What I'm going to report here is just a pilot study. The groups that I've managed to survey so far were very small, and the tools also probably need improvement, and I hope I'll get some comments and feedback from the audience that will help improve these tools. So the study sets out to answer 3 research questions, out of which 2 will be focused on today. Which of the 2 Polish versions of A Clockwork Orange can be predicted to achieve the cognitive effects that the author intended in the 21st century Polish reader? Does the post-communist generation respond to the 2 texts differently from those who spent their childhood and youth in communist Poland? And to answer these questions, in the first place, I had to select relevant material, relevant data that would elicit some sort of answers from the groups that I have decided to survey. These fragments of the source text were composed of full sentences, and they embraced sometimes more than one sentence of up to 100 words, in which neologisms would account for at least 10% of the word count. That was important because I wanted to make sure that there is actually this effect of the neologism and the language, the nadsat on that transpires from what my respondents get. These were extracted manually from the source text. It must be added at this point that neologism is defined in the study in a rather broad sense, as a new morpheme, word, or lexical unit that appears in a language. And on this approach, neologisms embrace borrowings. It must also be pointed out that I go along with Mattiello's ideas that in studying neologisms, there is a dose of subjectivity involved. As the author argues, neologisms are inherently transitional, in that the word may be a neologism for one language user and familiar to another. The fragments of the source text with neologisms, manually extracted, as I have already indicated, were matched with equivalent fragments in the Polish translation R and the Polish translation A, so the Russianized and American versions. And these were extracts were then used into mini surveys. So the data basically looked like this, the initial data. In red, what you can see in red are those nadsat expressions in the original. And then in 1R, you can see the Russianized version with Russian root words in red. And in the 1A version, you can see the red words that are transcriptions of English words in Polish. The green ones, the green words, the words marked in green belong to slang expressions, not necessarily of Russian or American origin for each of the versions. Now the design of the study. Well, the study actually involved two mini surveys. So there was part 1 and part 2. In the first mini survey, there were 9 students of English philology, all of them Polish native speakers, aged 20 to 25. All of them then born after the collapse of communism in Poland. Part 2 was also a mini survey, but this was a slightly different sort of mini survey in which the two versions R and A were used in a slightly different way. And these were actually used in a questionnaire with 20 respondents aged 31 to 40, that is people who were children where communism fell in Poland, or were born after the collapse of communism in Poland, which means that they were not exposed to Russian propaganda, were not exposed to Russian propaganda. They were not taught Russian as a second language at school. 10 of them filled in a mini survey on the Russianized version of the translation, and 10 filled in the mini survey on the Americanized version. The other group of respondents in this part of the study embraced 20 respondents aged 55 through 64, who were, in other words, fully mature when communism collapsed in Poland in 1989. This means that they were taught Russian at school as an obligatory school subject. Again, 10 were asked to fill in a mini survey which embraced the Russianized version of this translation, and the other 10 filled in a mini survey that embraced an American translation. Now, again, about the first mini survey, I would like to indicate that the one that was distributed among English philology students was about the rating on the contextual effects. In fact, I have approached people from my classes who were exposed to some relevance-theoretic, who were exposed to relevant information about relevance theory as a model of communication, and they were translation students. So we looked at how relevance theory can be used productively to account for certain important effects that that are crucial in the context of different translation problems. So the instruction for them actually read, please study 6 extracts of an English source text and 2 versions of the rendering in Polish. The special language in the source text is intended to introduce the reader to the alien and bizarre world of the future, in which important human values are challenged. For each fragment, rate the accuracy of the translated version A or B in terms of how likely it is to create cognitive effects in the Polish reader similar to those that the original may have been intended to create in the source text audience. Well, I called it a sort of accuracy rating for want of a better word, because neither equivalence nor faithfulness would actually be appropriate here. And they were using the scale from 1 to 10, where 10 meant that the cognitive effects that they intuitively could get from what they read were totally inaccurate, were totally different from the intended ones, and 10 was supposed to stand for perfect accuracy, that is the full range of cognitive effects achieved by the translation. So actually what it looked like was like this. You can now see in the slide that they actually could see the source text extract followed by 2 Polish translations. I didn't mark them as R and A, not to in any way sort of influence the students' thinking. They were just asked to do the rating on versions A and B. And in the next slide, you can see what the other mini survey was about. This mini survey was about actually 2 versions, that is the Russianized and the Americanized version. One group was actually surveyed on how they understood and how comprehensible they found the Russianized translation. This group embraced 10, what I am going to refer to as in a shortcut sort of version as communist era respondents, and 10 post-communist era respondents. The same group composition also was used in survey A, that is the Americanized, based on the Americanized version. The instruction was provided in Polish, and all the answers were in Polish apart from the rating answer. And they were asked to read the Polish translation of the fragments of the English source text, and for each decide how easy or difficult it was to understand it. And this wasn't quite a comprehensibility test. It wasn't about how easy or difficult it was to understand. It was mainly, I wanted mainly to make sure that they actually read this text carefully, because I wanted them then to answer some questions on the plot, and to share their opinions about the protagonist. So that was the reason why I asked them to do it. But of course, comprehensibility was also important. If they recognized the source text, then they were asked to provide the title, and for them the survey stopped. If they didn't, they were asked to go through a sort of very short mini survey in which they were asked about the kind of novel that they thought these extracts came from, what they thought about the setting of the plot, whether it was in Russia, USA, South America, or France, or another destination, how they thought, how they recognized the timing of the plot, etc. And now to the results, because I'm running out of time. So as far as the mini survey 1 is concerned, on the predictions about the cognitive effects, that is the mini survey that English philology students book. As you can see, well, the hypothesis that Russianized version will be rated higher was actually confirmed. As you can see in this table, where the Russianized version is actually highlighted in green, the Russianized version received higher ratings. That is, was rated as achieving more of the intended cognitive effects than the Americanized version. The lowest rating was for extract to American, the highest rating for extract 6 in the Russianized version. Interestingly enough, extract 6 is treated as more or less comprehensible to the same degree in both language versions. The overall mean, which is displayed in the next slide, suggests that precisely this working hypothesis that the Russianized version will be rated higher was actually confirmed. Now, as far as the results of the second mini survey are concerned, well, the comprehensibility rating were not that far apart for the two groups. As far as the Russianized version is concerned, young respondents sort of thought that it was barely understandable. And interestingly enough, the older respondents, those who were mature in 1988, who were exposed to Russian as the second language at school, did not consider it to be that so much more understandable. In fact, there is no statistically significant difference between the two groups, but so they can be sort of more or less seen as not very far from each other, quite close, in fact. As far as the survey A is concerned, that is the one based on the Americanized version, the mean is higher, as can obviously be expected, for young respondents, for whom English is probably no longer a foreign language, but the second one. And for mature respondents also is quite comprehensible, and they consider it to be a version that they find easier to understand than the Russianized version. So tentative conclusions. The Russianized version is likely to produce cognitive effects similar to those originally intended by the author, as at least that these are the intuitions. I do not, of course, pretend that I have actually investigated tangible cognitive effects, because that, I think, is beyond this kind of tool that was used. The survey was actually carried out before the war broke out in February, so the survey with the students of English philology. Now, the Russianized version is overall considered more difficult to understand by both younger and older respondents, with the overall mean being 5.35 versus for the Russianized version and 7.75 for the Americanized version. So even older generation find anglicized neologisms easier to understand than Russian neologisms. But it must also be considered and taken into account that the mini survey 2 was conducted after the war broke out in February, so surely affective factors might be involved. Now, this study, of course, has got some obvious limitations related to the small number of respondents and, of course, the intuitions that are being tapped into. So obviously, I'm fully aware of these. But I wonder what your response might be, and I'll be happy to answer questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maria. And well, surely there are questions. We don't have much time. Actually, the time originally intended for questions has been taken up by the presentation. That's because of the technical difficulties. I'm sure about that.
Apologize.
Well, perhaps we could transfer the discussion some, unless I don't know. So okay, I assume that who wants to leave the session because they need the break before the plenary lecture might do so now, but perhaps and ask you a question via email. And if there are some questions, those who can stay will stay. Okay, there is one question from Fabrizia.
We can't hear you.
You are probably muted, or something is, sorry, I was struggling with the presentation.
Before Fabrizio is unmuted, I'll probably thank him for his presentation, because he there made reference to intuition-based studies, and I was happy to hear that that's the kind of study that you consider useful in translation studies. We can't.
Okay, so now we also have gestures, and we also have, you know, all sorts of non-verbal communication going on, and technology has beaten us completely.
Exactly.
So we are completely, you know, defenseless in the light of all this. Perhaps there is somebody else who would like to ask a question or make a comment, or we've been successfully discouraged by technology once again. Okay, so if that's the case, so thank you very much, Maria, all the speakers in this session and the audience, and see you soon.
Thank you.